In the annals of human history, few stories have captured the imagination and stirred the hearts of people across generations quite like the tale of David and Goliath. It's a story that transcends time, culture, and circumstance. A story that speaks to the deepest part of the human spirit, where faith meets fear, where courage confronts impossibility, and where the smallest among us can achieve the greatest victories. Today, we journey back nearly 3,000 years to a dusty valley in ancient Israel, where a shepherd boy would face a giant warrior in a confrontation that would echo through eternity. This is not merely a story of physical combat, but a profound testament to the power of unwavering faith, the strength found in humility, and the truth that victory belongs not to the mighty, but to those who trust in something greater than themselves. The year was approximately 1025 BCE. The land of Israel was caught in the turbulent transition between the age of judges and the establishment of the monarchy. For centuries, the 12 tribes of Israel had been loosely confederated under the leadership of judges, charismatic leaders raised up by God to deliver His people from their enemies and guide them in times of crisis. But the people grew restless. They looked around at the neighboring nations with their powerful kings, their organized armies, their impressive palaces and military might. The Israelites began to feel inferior, disorganized, vulnerable. They came to the prophet Samuel with a demand that would change their destiny forever. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations. Samuel was deeply troubled by this request. He understood that Israel's strength had never come from earthly monarchy or military might, but from their unique covenant relationship with the Almighty. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been their king, their protector, their guide through the wilderness and into the promised land. But the people insisted, and after seeking divine guidance, Samuel reluctantly anointed Saul, a tall and handsome Benjamite, as Israel's first king. Saul began his reign with promise and early victories. He was physically impressive, standing head and shoulders above his contemporaries. His early military campaigns against the Ammonites brought him popular acclaim. But the burden of kingship proved heavier than anyone had anticipated. The constant pressure of defending a nation surrounded by hostile neighbors, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and the spiritual responsibility of leading God's chosen people began to take their toll. The most persistent and dangerous threat came from the west, from the coastal region, where the Philistines had established themselves as the dominant military power in the region. The Philistines were not a nomadic tribe or a disorganized collection of raiders. They were a sophisticated people with advanced metallurgy, organized military tactics, and a burning ambition to expand their territory inland. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines possessed superior weapons technology, including iron implements and weapons, at a time when most of Israel still relied on bronze. They controlled the coastal trade routes and had established a pentapolis, 5 major cities from which they launched their campaigns of conquest and intimidation. For the Israelites, the Philistine threat was existential. These were not merely political enemies seeking territorial advantage. The Philistines represented a completely different worldview, a different understanding of power, success, and divine favor. Their gods were gods of war and fertility. Their culture celebrated physical strength and military prowess above all else. The Philistines had another significant advantage. They understood the psychological dimension of warfare. They knew that battles were often won or lost in the minds of soldiers before the first spear was thrown or the first sword was drawn. They specialized in intimidation, in creating such overwhelming displays of power that their enemies would surrender without significant resistance. This psychological warfare took many forms. Sometimes it was the sheer size of their armies, with ranks of disciplined soldiers stretching across the horizon. Sometimes it was their superior weapons and armor glinting menacingly in the sunlight. And sometimes it was the presence of individual warriors so formidable, so physically imposing, that they seemed to embody the invincible power of the Philistine war machine. Into this context of national tension, military threat, and spiritual uncertainty, our story begins to unfold. King Saul, despite his early promise, was struggling. The weight of leadership had revealed character flaws that would ultimately prove fatal to his reign. His relationship with the prophet Samuel had deteriorated due to acts of disobedience and presumption. The divine favor that had once rested upon him was beginning to withdraw, leaving him increasingly isolated, paranoid, and desperate. The Israelite army, reflecting their king's internal turmoil, lacked confidence and cohesion. They were facing an enemy that seemed superior in every measurable way, better equipped, better organized, more experienced, and more ruthless. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only military might, but the very foundations of faith itself. Meanwhile, in the hill country of Judah, in the small town of Bethlehem, lived a family that seemed utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of national politics and military strategy. Jesse, a sheep farmer and grain grower, was raising 8 sons in relative obscurity. He was a man of modest means, known in his community for his integrity and his flocks of sheep that grazed on the surrounding hillsides. Jesse's 7 older sons were typical young men of their time and place, strong from years of agricultural work, familiar with the basic weapons needed to protect livestock from predators. They were exactly the kind of men that King Saul's recruiters sought for his army. When the call came for able-bodied men to join the king's forces against the Philistine threat, these 7 brothers answered without hesitation. But there was an 8th son, the youngest, who remained behind. His name was David, and he seemed destined for a life of obscurity, tending his father's sheep in the fields around Bethlehem. While his brothers marched off to war, David continued the quiet, solitary work of a shepherd. Little did anyone know that this youngest son carried within him a destiny that would reshape the course of history. David was not impressive by the standards of his day. He was young, probably in his mid to late teens, with the lean build of someone who spent his days walking long distances across rough terrain. He had the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors, the keen eyes of someone constantly scanning for predators, and the patient temperament necessary for the solitary life of a shepherd. But there was something different about David, something that set him apart from his brothers and from the other young men of Bethlehem. It wasn't his physical appearance or his family connections. It wasn't his education or his wealth or his social status. What made David different was the depth of his relationship with God. The hills around Bethlehem provided the perfect setting for spiritual contemplation. During the long hours watching his father's flocks, David had developed an intimate awareness of the Creator's presence in the natural world. He saw God's handiwork in the changing seasons, in the movements of the stars, in the behavior of the animals under his care. The solitude that might have driven another young man to distraction became for David a sanctuary of prayer and worship. David was also a musician and a poet. He had learned to play the harp, and during the quiet hours of shepherding, he would compose songs of praise and worship. These weren't the formal liturgical compositions that might be heard in the tabernacle, but the spontaneous outpourings of a heart that had learned to see God's presence everywhere. The Psalms that would later be attributed to David reveal the depth of his spiritual insight, his honest wrestling with questions of faith, and his unshakable confidence in God's faithfulness. But David's faith was not merely theoretical or emotional. It had been tested and proven in the practical challenges of shepherding. The hills of Judea were home to predators that wielded a constant threat to sheep lions, from the deeper wilderness bears that came down from the mountains and human thieves who would steal livestock under cover of darkness. On more than one occasion, David had faced these threats with nothing but his staff, his sling, and his faith in God's protection. He had killed a lion that attacked his flock, striking it down with a stone from his sling, and then finishing it with his bare hands. He had done the same to a bear protecting sheep that were not merely livestock to him, but a sacred trust from his father, and ultimately from God. These encounters had taught David several crucial lessons that would prove essential in the greater challenges that lay ahead. First, he had learned that physical size and apparent strength were not the determining factors in conflict. The wild animals he had faced were certainly larger and seemingly more powerful than he was, but speed, accuracy, courage, and divine assistance had proven more than adequate to overcome the disparity. Second, David had learned to trust his weapons. The sling was not a toy or a casual tool, but a precision instrument in the hands of someone who had mastered its use. Through countless hours of practice, David had developed extraordinary accuracy. With his sling, he could hit targets at distances that would challenge modern marksmen, and he could do so with enough force to stun or kill even large animals. Most importantly, David had learned to see every challenge through the lens of his relationship with God. When he protected his sheep from predators, he wasn't merely fulfilling his responsibilities as a shepherd, he was participating in God's ongoing work of protecting and providing for his creation. This perspective would prove crucial when David faced his greatest challenge. The turning point in David's life came through an event that seemed on the surface to have nothing to do with him. The prophet Samuel, acting under divine instruction, came to Bethlehem with a specific mission. God had rejected Saul as king due to his disobedience and had chosen a replacement from among Jesse's sons. Samuel was to anoint this new king, though the actual transition of power would not occur for many years. When Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, he called Jesse and his sons to a sacrificial feast. One by one, Jesse presented his sons to the prophet. Samuel looked first at Eliab, the eldest, who was tall and handsome with the bearing of a natural leader. Surely this was God's chosen king. But God spoke to Samuel's heart. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. One by one, each of Jesse's 7 sons was presented to Samuel, and one by one, God indicated that none of these was his chosen. Finally, Samuel asked Jesse if these were all his sons. Almost as an afterthought, Jesse mentioned that his youngest son was out in the fields with the sheep. "Send and get him," Samuel commanded, "for we will not sit down until he comes here." When David arrived, still bearing the dust and smell of the sheepfold, Samuel knew immediately that this was God's choice. The biblical account describes David as ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. But more importantly, God had already prepared his heart for the enormous responsibility that lay ahead. In the presence of his family, Samuel took out his horn of oil and anointed David as the future king of Israel. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David. This anointing was not merely a symbolic act or a human appointment to office. It was a divine empowerment, a spiritual transformation that would enable David to fulfill his calling as God's chosen leader. But the path from anointing to throne would be long and difficult. For now David returned to his sheep, carrying within him the knowledge of his divine calling, but continuing to live the humble life of a shepherd. This period of waiting and preparation would prove crucial in shaping David's character and deepening his dependence on God. Meanwhile, the situation with King Saul was deteriorating rapidly. As God's Spirit departed from Saul, he began to experience severe psychological distress. His advisors, seeking some way to bring him relief, suggested that music might soothe his troubled spirit. They recommended a young man from Bethlehem who was skilled with the harp and known for his godly character. So David entered the royal court not as a future king, but as a musician and occasional armor-bearer to Saul. This position gave David invaluable experience in leadership, military strategy, and court politics. He observed firsthand the complexities of ruling a nation, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and the spiritual dangers that came with power and position. During this time, David's brothers continued to serve in Saul's army, which was engaged in an ongoing conflict with the Philistines. The war had settled into a tense stalemate, with both armies positioned on opposite hills across a valley, neither willing to risk a full-scale battle that might result in devastating losses. This was the situation when David's life took another dramatic turn. Jesse, concerned for his sons serving in the army and wanting to maintain contact with them, prepared a care package of food and supplies. He instructed David to take these provisions to his brothers and to bring back word of their welfare. David's journey from Bethlehem to the army camp took him through familiar territory across the same hills where he had spent countless hours with his father's flocks. As he approached the Israelite encampment, he could see the scale of the military operation that had been mobilized against the Philistine threat. Thousands of soldiers were arranged in battle formations, their weapons and armor gleaming in the morning sunlight. But David also sensed something troubling about the atmosphere in the camp. There was tension in the air, a palpable fear that seemed to grip the soldiers. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, and men's eyes frequently turned toward the valley that separated the two armies. Something was happening that had shaken the confidence of Israel's fighting men. David located his brothers and delivered the provisions from their far-fetched dweller. As they talked, sharing news from home and updates on the military situation, a commotion began to stir throughout the camp. Soldiers were moving toward the edge of the hill, gathering to watch some event unfolding in the valley below. The scene that David witnessed when he joined the crowd of spectators would be burned into his memory forever. On the opposite hill, the Philistine army was arrayed in battle formation, their bronze armor and iron weapons creating a formidable display of military might. But it was not the army itself that commanded attention. Instead, all eyes were focused on a single figure who had emerged from the Philistine ranks and was making his way down into the valley. This was no ordinary soldier. Even at a distance, his extraordinary size was apparent. As he drew closer to the center of the valley, the true magnitude of his physical presence became clear. This was Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion, and he was unlike anything the Israelite soldiers had ever encountered. Goliath stood approximately 9 feet tall, a giant among men, even in an age when physical stature was highly valued. But it was not merely his height that made him so intimidating. His entire frame was proportionally massive, with the thick bones and powerful musculature of someone bred for warfare. He moved with the confident gait of a warrior who had never known defeat, his every step radiating menace and contempt for his enemies. His armor was a masterpiece of ancient metallurgy and craftsmanship. He wore a bronze helmet that covered his head and neck with plates that protected his face while still allowing him to see and breathe freely. His body armor was a coat of bronze scale mail, each individual scale carefully crafted and fitted to provide maximum protection while still allowing freedom of movement. The biblical account records that this armor alone weighed approximately 125 pounds more than many full-grown men. On his legs, Goliath wore bronze greaves that protected his shins and calves from attack. His feet were shod in bronze as well, giving him sure footing on the rocky terrain of the valley floor. Every piece of his defensive equipment spoke of wealth craftsmanship and preparation for battle. But it was Goliath's weapons that truly revealed the magnitude of the threat he represented. In his hand, he carried a spear that was more like a small tree than a conventional weapon. The biblical description compares the wooden shaft to a weaver's bisht beam, indicating both its thickness and its length. The iron spearhead alone weighed 15 pounds more than most entire weapons of the time. Strapped to his back was a sword of similar proportions, its bronze and iron construction representing the finest weaponry available to ancient armies. On his arm, he bore a shield that was large enough to provide full-body protection, carried by a shield-bearer who walked before him to ensure that Goliath's hands remained free to wield his offensive weapons. But perhaps the most intimidating aspect of Goliath's appearance was his absolute confidence. This was not a man who harbored any doubt about the outcome of battle. His posture, his expression, his very presence communicated the certainty of victory. He had undoubtedly faced many enemies in combat, and none had been able to stand against him. As Goliath reached the center of the valley, he stopped and turned to face the Israelite army. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the distance, reaching every ear in both camps. What followed was not merely a challenge to combat, but a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to demoralize and humiliate his enemies. "Choose a man for yourselves," Goliath shouted, his voice booming across the valley like thunder. "Let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." This was the ancient practice of single combat, where the outcome of an entire battle could be decided by the confrontation between two individual champions. It was a way of resolving conflicts without the massive casualties that would result from full-scale battle. But for such a system to work, both sides needed to have confidence in their champion's ability to prevail. Goliath continued his challenge, his words dripping with contempt and mockery. "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." The effect of Goliath's challenge on the Israelite army was immediate and devastating. These were experienced soldiers, men who had faced combat before and survived. But none of them had ever encountered anything like the giant who stood before them. The sheer physical impossibility of defeating such an opponent in hand-to-hand combat was obvious to everyone present. More than that, Goliath's challenge struck at the very heart of Israel's understanding of themselves as God's chosen people. If they were truly under divine protection, if their God was truly more powerful than the gods of their enemies, why could they not produce a champion capable of meeting this challenge? The silence from the Israelite rear ranks was deafening. Thousands of soldiers, including experienced officers and battle-hardened veterans, stood mute before Goliath's challenge. King Saul, who had once been chosen partly for his impressive physical stature, made no move to accept the challenge himself. The paralysis of fear had gripped the entire army. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath repeated his challenge. Each time he emerged from the Philistine camp and took his position in the valley, hurling insults and challenges at the Israelite army. And each time the response was the same: silence, fear, and humiliation. The psychological impact of this daily ritual cannot be overstated. Every morning, the Israelite soldiers woke knowing that they would again face the reminder of their apparent powerlessness. Every evening, they went to sleep with the giant's mocking voice echoing in their ears. The very foundations of their confidence as warriors and as God's people were being systematically eroded. It was into this atmosphere of fear and demoralization that David arrived with his father's provisions. As he listened to Goliath's challenge and observed the reaction of the Israelite army, David's response was dramatically different from that of the soldiers around him. Where others saw an impossible challenge, David saw an opportunity. Where others heard the boasting of an invincible warrior, David heard the blasphemous ravings of someone who dared to defy the living God. Where others felt paralyzed by fear, David felt stirred to righteous anger. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" David asked, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence that followed Goliath's latest challenge, that he should defy the armies of the living God. David's question revealed the fundamental difference in his perspective. While everyone else was focused on Goliath's physical advantages, his superior weapons and armor, his intimidating presence, David saw the situation through spiritual eyes. This was not merely a conflict between two human armies, it was a confrontation between the true God and the false gods of the Philistines. The soldiers around David were shocked by his words. Here was a young man, probably still a teenager, with no military experience or training, speaking boldly about a situation that had reduced seasoned warriors to trembling silence. Some of them began to explain to David just how dangerous Goliath was, how impossible it would be for anyone to defeat him in combat. But David was not impressed by their explanations. He had already seen God's power demonstrated in his own life in his victories over the lion and the bear. He understood that the same God who had delivered him from the claws and teeth of wild beasts was more than capable of dealing with any human enemy, regardless of size or weaponry. Word of David's bold statements quickly reached his oldest brother Eliab. When Eliab heard what David was saying, he was furious. Perhaps he was embarrassed that his youngest brother was speaking so boldly when he and his fellow soldiers remained silent. Perhaps he was genuinely concerned for David's safety. Or perhaps he was revealing his own deep-seated resentment at being passed over when Samuel anointed David as the future king. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demanded angrily. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. You have come down to see the battle." Eliab's words reveal the common human tendency to diminish others when we feel threatened by their courage or faith. Rather than being inspired by David's confidence in God, Eliab tried to reduce his brother's motivation to mere curiosity or show-off behavior. This reaction would be repeated throughout David's life as his faith and courage challenged others to examine their own limitations. But David was not deterred by his brother's rebuke. "What have I done now?" he replied. "Was it not but a word?" David understood that words matter, especially words that reveal faith or the lack of it. His question about Goliath was not idle curiosity. It was a statement of faith that would soon be tested in the most dramatic way possible. As David continued to circulate through the camp, asking questions and making observations about the situation, his words eventually reached the attention of King Saul himself. The king, desperate for any possible solution to the crisis that was destroying his army's morale, summoned the young man to his tent. The meeting between Saul and David was a study in contrast. Saul, tall and physically impressive, bore the weight of kingship and the burden of repeated failures. His mental and spiritual condition had deteriorated significantly since his anointing years earlier. He was a man haunted by the knowledge that God had rejected him, tormented by fears and suspicions, and increasingly desperate for any sign of divine favor or assistance. David, on the other hand, appeared before the king as he was young, unpretentious, still carrying the dust of the road and the smell of sheep from his journey. But there was something in his bearing, something in his eyes that commanded attention. This was not the demeanor of someone seeking personal gain or glory. This was the confidence of someone who had encountered God and been transformed by that encounter. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David said to Saul, referring to Goliath. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul's initial reaction was exactly what might be expected. He looked at this young man, clearly still in his teens, with no visible armor or weapons, no evident military training or experience, and saw nothing but a recipe for disaster. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," Saul replied, "for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Saul's assessment was reasonable from a human perspective. Goliath was not only physically imposing, but also professionally trained. He had spent his entire adult life learning the arts of warfare, mastering weapons, developing battle tactics, and gaining experience in combat. David appeared to have none of these qualifications. But David's response revealed the source of his confidence, and it had nothing to do with conventional military qualifications. He began to tell Saul about his experiences as a shepherd, about the times when lions and bears had threatened his father's flocks, and how God had delivered him in those encounters. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep," David explained, "and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." This was not boasting or exaggeration. David was simply stating the facts of his experience. He had faced predators that were larger, stronger, and better armed than he was, and God had given him victory. The lion's claws were sharper than any sword. The bear's teeth were more dangerous than any spear. Yet David had prevailed because the battle belonged to the Lord. David continued drawing the parallel that would become the foundation of his strategy. "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Here was the crucial insight that separated David from every other person in both camps. While everyone else saw Goliath as a unique and unprecedented threat, David saw him as simply another predator threatening God's people. The principle was the same: God would deliver his servant from the hand of his enemies. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear," David declared with absolute conviction, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul found himself in an impossible position. The logical part of his mind recognized that sending this young man against Goliath was almost certainly sending him to his death. But 40 days of humiliation had taken their toll. The king was desperate for any solution, even one that seemed hopeless from a human perspective. Moreover, there was something about David's confidence that stirred a distant memory of what faith in God could accomplish. Finally, Saul made his decision. "Go," he said to David, "and the Lord be with you." Having given his consent, Saul tried to increase David's chances of survival by offering him the best equipment available. He clothed David with his own armor coat of mail that represented the finest protective gear in the Israelite army. He put a bronze helmet on David's head and gave him his own sword. But when David tried to move while wearing Saul's armor, he immediately realized that it was unsuitable for his purposes. The armor was sized for Saul's much larger frame and was far heavier than anything David was accustomed to wearing. More importantly, it was not the equipment that God had used to give David victory in his previous encounters with dangerous enemies. "I cannot go with these," David told Saul, "for I have not tested them." He removed the armor and the sword, choosing instead to face Goliath with the simple tools that had served him as a shepherd: his staff, his sling, and his absolute trust in God's faithfulness. David's rejection of conventional weapons and armor was not false humility or religious fanaticism. It was the practical wisdom of someone who understood his own abilities and limitations. He had spent years mastering the use of a sling, developing accuracy and power that few could match. The sling was not a toy or a primitive weapon, but a precision instrument capable of delivering a stone with tremendous force over considerable distances. As David prepared for the confrontation that would define his life, he made one final preparation. He went down to a nearby brook and selected 5 smooth stones, placing them in his shepherd's pouch. The choice of 5 stones has been the subject of much speculation. Perhaps David wanted to ensure that he had backup ammunition in case his first shot missed or proved insufficient. Perhaps the number 5 had symbolic significance in his mind, or perhaps, as some have suggested, David knew that Goliath had 4 brothers who were also giants, and he wanted to be prepared for whatever might follow. Whatever his reasoning, David's selection of stones was done with the same care and attention to detail that characterized his approach to shepherding. These were not random pebbles picked up in haste, but carefully chosen projectiles, each one evaluated for weight, shape, and aerodynamic properties. In David's experienced hands, these simple stones would become instruments of divine judgment. As word spread through both camps that a champion had finally emerged from the Israelite ranks, the reaction was dramatically different on each side of the valley. Among the Philistines, there was amusement and contempt. They had expected Israel to eventually produce a warrior of some stature, someone who might at least make the combat interesting, even if he could not hope to defeat their champion. Instead, they saw what appeared to be a young shepherd with no armor, no conventional weapons, and no evident qualifications for single combat. Among the Israelites, the reaction was more complex. There was certainly fear for David's safety and concern about the likely outcome of the confrontation. But there was also a stirring of something that had been missing from the camp for 40 days: hope. Here, finally, was someone willing to act on behalf of God's people, someone who refused to be paralyzed by fear or intimidated by apparently impossible odds. As David made his way down into the valley carrying his staff and sling with his pouch of stones at his side, he was walking into more than a physical confrontation. He was walking into a moment that would test everything he believed about God, about faith, and about the nature of true strength. Behind him, thousands of soldiers watched in tense silence. Ahead of him, the most formidable warrior of his generation awaited with supreme confidence in his own invincibility. The distance between the two armies was not great, perhaps a few hundred yards across the floor of the valley. But for David, each step carried enormous significance. With every stride, he was moving further from the safety of his own lines and closer to an enemy who had never known defeat in single combat. Yet his pace was steady, his bearing confident, and his heart fixed on the God who had called him to this moment. As David approached the center of the valley, Goliath began his own advance from the Philistine lines. The giant moved with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment and no doubt expecting his young opponent to lose courage and flee when the full magnitude of his size and power became apparent at close range. When the two champions were close enough to speak clearly to each other, Goliath stopped and studied his opponent with obvious disdain. What he saw confirmed his lowest expectations: a youth with no armor, carrying what appeared to be toys rather than weapons. Approaching him with what could only be described as naive confidence. Goliath's first words were designed to humiliate David, and by extension, the entire Israelite army that had sent him. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. He had prepared for battle against a worthy opponent, and instead found himself facing what appeared to be a shepherd boy with a walking stick. The giant's anger was not merely personal, but professional. His reputation as an invincible warrior was built on victories against formidable opponents. If he defeated this young man easily, as seemed inevitable, there would be no glory in the victory. It would be remembered as the time when Israel's desperation drove them to sacrifice a child rather than face him with a true warrior. Goliath continued his psychological assault, cursing David by his gods and making a threat that was calculated to strike terror into his opponent's heart. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." This was more than a threat of death. It was a promise of ultimate honor. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, proper burial was essential for the departed soul's rest and the family's honor. To leave a body unburied exposed to scavenging animals was the ultimate humiliation. Goliath was promising David not merely death, but shameful, dishonoring death that would bring disgrace to his family and his people. But if Goliath expected his words to produce fear, confusion, or retreat, he was profoundly mistaken. David's response revealed the vast difference in their understanding of the situation and the source of true power. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin," David replied, his voice carrying clearly across the valley and reaching the ears of soldiers in both armies. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." With these words, David transformed the entire nature of the confrontation. This was no longer merely a fight between two individuals, one large and well-armed, the other small and apparently defenseless. This had become a confrontation between competing claims about the nature of ultimate reality and the source of true power. David continued his words, growing more confident and prophetic. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Here was boldness that went far beyond personal courage. David was making promises about the outcome of battle that from a human perspective seemed not merely optimistic, but delusional. He was promising not only his own victory over Goliath, but the defeat of the entire Philistine army. And he was stating that the purpose of this victory would be to demonstrate to the watching world the reality and power of Israel's God. David's final words before the battle began contained the theological heart of the entire story. "And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into all hands." This declaration revealed David's complete understanding of what was about to occur. The outcome of this battle would not be determined by weapons armor training or physical strength. It would be determined by God's choice to demonstrate his power through weakness, his strength through what appeared to be foolishness. The theological implications of David's words would echo through the centuries. Here was a preview of the biblical principle that God's ways are not human ways, that He often chooses the weak things of the world to shame the strong, the foolish things to shame the wise. As David finished speaking, both champions began their final approach toward each other. Goliath, perhaps stirred to greater anger by David's bold words, quickened his pace. His shield-bearer moved ahead of him, ensuring that his master remained protected as they closed the distance. David, meanwhile, reached into his shepherd's pouch and selected one of his carefully chosen stones. He placed it in his sling and began to build momentum with. In the annals of human history, few stories have captured the imagination and stirred the hearts of people across generations quite like the tale of David and Goliath. It's a story that transcends time, culture, and circumstance. A story that speaks to the deepest part of the human spirit, where faith meets fear, where courage confronts impossibility, and where the smallest among us can achieve the greatest victories. Today, we journey back nearly 3,000 years to a dusty valley in ancient Israel, where a shepherd boy would face a giant warrior in a confrontation that would echo through eternity. This is not merely a story of physical combat, but a profound testament to the power of unwavering faith, the strength found in humility, and the truth that victory belongs not to the mighty, but to those who trust in something greater than themselves. The year was approximately 1025 BCE. The land of Israel was caught in the turbulent transition between the age of judges and the establishment of the monarchy. For centuries, the 12 tribes of Israel had been loosely confederated under the leadership of the judges, charismatic leaders, raised up by God to deliver His people from their enemies and guide them in times of crisis. But the people grew restless. They looked around at the neighboring nations with their powerful kings, their organized armies, their impressive palaces, and military might. The Israelites began to feel inferior, disorganized, vulnerable. They came to the prophet Samuel with a demand that would change their destiny forever. Give us a king to judge us like all the nations. Samuel was deeply troubled by this request. He understood that Israel's strength had never come from earthly monarchy or military might, but from their unique covenant relationship with the Almighty. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been their king, their protector, their guide through the wilderness and into the promised land. But the people insisted, and after seeking divine guidance, Samuel reluctantly anointed Saul, a tall and handsome Benjamite, as Israel's first king. Saul began his reign with promise and early victories. He was physically impressive, standing head and shoulders above his contemporaries. His early military campaigns against the Ammonites brought him popular acclaim. But the burden of kingship proved heavier than anyone had anticipated. The constant pressure of defending a nation surrounded by hostile neighbors. The weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives and the spiritual responsibility of leading God's chosen people began to take their toll. The most persistent and dangerous threat came from the west, from the coastal region, where the Philistines had established themselves as the dominant military power in the region. The Philistines were not a nomadic tribe or a disorganized collection of raiders. They were a sophisticated people with advanced metallurgy, organized military tactics, and a burning ambition to expand their territory inland. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines possessed superior weapons technology, including iron implements and weapons, at a time when most of Israel still relied on bronze. They controlled the coastal trade routes and had established a pentapolis, 5 major cities, from which they launched their campaigns of conquest and intimidation. For the Israelites, the Philistine threat was existential. These were not merely political enemies seeking territorial advantage. The Philistines represented a completely different worldview, a different understanding of power, success, and divine favor. Their gods were gods of war and fertility. Their culture celebrated physical strength and military prowess above all else. The Philistines had another significant advantage. They understood the psychological dimension of warfare. They knew that battles were often won or lost in the minds of soldiers before the first spear was thrown or the first sword was drawn. They specialized in intimidation, in creating such overwhelming displays of power that their enemies would surrender without significant resistance.